a little more spice than I think I would recommend. But they're super, super, super well made. I mean, just really high quality. So, yep.
That kind of leads me to one observation I was going to make, or question I was going to ask, which is, and please don't misinterpret what I'm getting ready to say, but a lot of wineries, I mean, there are wineries in every state in the United States. There's even a winery that makes pineapple wine in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And most of the wineries in the United States that are not in California, Oregon, Washington State, or perhaps Virginia, or maybe Missouri, the wineries are as much a tourist destination as they are intending to make great wine. But certainly your winery is not just intended to be a tourist destination. Your intent is to make world-class wine.
No, I mean, you nailed it. For those who've never been, it's a big black building on top of a hill with very little windows, no signs. We've never had a public tasting room. We've always only done by appointment. And that was from the beginning, because my thinking was, we're here to make wine. And that was the intention from the beginning. I mean, if we were here to be an entertainment venue, I would have done a completely different program. We're wine guys. This is Louis and I. This is what's in our veins. And making dry Riesling and Cab Franc and Pinot, especially dry Riesling, is probably about the most difficult thing you could want to do in the U.S. because the history and the brand image is so horrendous. We're slowly changing that. I mean, quicker than ever, actually. But no, we're wine guys, and literally the reason I have people here now, I didn't advertise it. We created something called the Salon because Forge people become very much Forge people. They enjoy the terroir, they enjoy what we do, and they kind of become this part of this really cool club because we're not mainstream, right? And so during COVID, a lot of my good customers were like, Rick, you travel, you love food, you like design. I design the winery, I design everything here. And why don't you create a small space where we can enjoy a bottle on occasion? And so I threw this thing together called the Salon, and it's been phenomenal. And we didn't talk about it, we didn't push it. We hand sliced a bit of ham. We have some conserva, and people can sit in a really nice atmosphere with friends, with like club chairs, and drink good bottles and have a chat. And it's very much about the wine even now. So that was really a result of my customers just saying, listen, we like hanging out here. We like drinking these wines with other people. Can you create this space for us? So we did. And it's a pop-up. It won't be here. I start bottling on Monday, and that space goes away because we use that space to bottle. So it's a shame because people they want to come all the time, but it goes away for a week, and then it comes back next week. It's here for 2 weeks. It goes away again, and then harvest, it goes away, and it comes back after harvest. So it's been pretty wild. Yeah.
You've mentioned, well, first I would encourage everyone joining us to pour themselves a glass of the classic, the Riesling Classic. Do you pronounce it classic or classique?
All right, I finished my beer. Now I can have wine. I was dying. Classique. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Classic. Really, and that came from my partner who's French. He just used to always say classique. And so we started saying classique in the cellar, and now it just became classique. Yeah.
You've referenced a couple of times that you are a wine guy, and obviously your partner is a really famous wine guy. I assume he's your partner. Business partner.
Yeah.
And he is the owner of, I never know whether to call it Chateau de Saint Combe, or just Chateau
Foam,
Saint Combe,
St.
or
Foam. Yeah, we just say St. Foam. It's easier.
depending on which bottle you're looking at, it has, they seem to have a lot of different names.
Yeah.
But they, I guess it was 15 or 16 years ago, he kind of burst out of nowhere as this blazing comet in Gigondas, that all of a sudden his winery was making the best wines in the, I mean, just out of kind of out of a no, my perception was out of nowhere making the best wines in the appellation, and continues to do so. And his single vineyard wines obviously are just mind-bogglingly great.
Yeah, I've been working with Louis since 1999, and I was a buyer of his wines for an importer distributor I worked for in the Northeast in about 5 states, I guess, and that's how we started our relationship. And we always tasted really well together. I was also a buyer for Kermit Lynch wines, so about 12, 15 years of my life were spent, on buying trips and spending about 30 or 45 days a year in cellars buying wine and tasting a lot. And we would taste in 2 weeks, 1,600 wines on every trip. And it was like going to college. And when I tasted with Louis, we always tasted very, very well together and had very similar ideas about wine. And that friendship developed and over the years. And then we were having lunch in Gigondas one day. And over lunch, I was explaining to him where I lived and what an interesting place it was. And that I thought there was immense potential. And another winemaker, friend, Olivier Humbrecht from Alsace, had told me such years ago that he really felt that the Finger Lakes offered some of the greatest potential in the U.S. And that kind of piqued Louis' curiosity. And he said, well, maybe one day I'd like to come see these lakes. And I said, yeah, you should. It's interesting. And it wasn't 30 days later, the phone rang. And he said, hey, I'm in the States. Can I come see these lakes? And I'm like, absolutely, come on up. And next thing you know, he was here. And we were tasting the wines together and driving around looking at terroir. And we had many, many conversations. And it took us a couple of years. But then at one point, I was driving through New Jersey with him and two other winemakers from France. And he turned to me and said, I want to make wine with you in the lakes. And I about drove off the road because, this was after, he 100 points from Parker and top 100, top 5, top 2, whatever. And so he was well known at the time. And so I got to the hotel and I called my wife and I said, you're not going to believe this, but Louis wants to make wine in the lakes. And she was like, yeah, that's nice. How are you going to do that? You work full time. And I said, well, frankly, when you have this kind of opportunity, you figure it out. I had moved here in the mid 90s to make wine. I couldn't afford to go to UC Davis. So I left a job at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia, where I kind of grew up in the service business. And I moved up here to make wine. And I said to my wife, I've always wanted to make wine. I've always wanted to own a winery. And I said, we're going to do this. So that was 10 years ago. and I'm still doing both jobs. I still work for a importer distributor and I run the winery. And Louis is at his estate. So we've, from the beginning, made a decision that we were going to leave everything in the winery and just continue to reinvest. And that's what we've done. And we're at a point now where the winery is pretty built out. It has pretty much everything it needs. And I think we're ready to jump the quality up again. And the 2019s, I think, are an indication of the direction we're going. They're pretty special.
There's some incredible coincidences that have popped up in what you said in the last few minutes.
Yeah.
Bruce Nyers called me Monday, who was the national director of sales for Kermit Lynch for decades.
Oh yeah, he's a mentor. He's a mentor.
Well, he called me Monday and he said, because I had a tasting of his wines on this day last year, or approximately this day last year. And at the end of the tasting, I said, Bruce, would you be willing to make this an annual event? And he said, yes. And it was on his calendar. So he called me Monday and said, are we still having a tasting on Saturday? I said, no, I'm having a tasting with Forge Cellars. I can't do one with you. He didn't mention that he knew you. I think he was kind of offended. We've been friends for 30 years, Bruce and I have been good friends for a long time. And
wow, that's amazing.
If I weren't talking to you right now, I would be talking to Bruce Nyers.
Boy, I want to text him right now and just give him hell. Bruce is one of my mentors. I can name on one hand, Jean-Marie Gouffens, Olivier Homebresh, Bruce Nyers. These are guys that had huge impact in my life. And Bruce is at the top of the heap. And I learned so much from Bruce. And man, it kind of makes me weepy thinking that I'm taking his place today. It's pretty cool because, geez, I always aspired to be as good as Bruce. And so maybe one day we'll get to that point, But he sold me my first barrel. He sold me a barrel, an old Chardonnay barrel back in the day when I was playing around making some wine in a basement. And yeah, Bruce is epic. I'll tell you a quick thing about Bruce. When we would travel in France, when we walked into restaurants, he would hand somebody a wine list, and their job was to order wines before he sat down, because Bruce never wanted to sit down without wine. He would get so annoyed. And the year I began ordering ordering at dinner, and I gained his confidence that for a couple, 2-3 years there, I was the guy who got the list when I came in the door. Wow. And that was like, your sensei, your teacher, saying, I trust you, you'll be okay. And so man, I'd grab that list and I'd run right to the waiter walking through the door, and I'd say, all right, we need the 2002 Monte de Tenere from Ravenel. I need 2 bottles of that. Behind that, we're going to have the Alt Merceau from TA. That needs to come immediately. And I would organize everything, and Bruce would sit down, and here comes the first bottle. Boom. Yeah.
I met Bruce at Trevina for dinner one night in Napa. There were 3 of us, and he brought 36 bottles of wine.
Bruce.
3 people. They seated us at a table for 6 because we needed the room for all the wine he brought. We tasted 30, we drank, I don't know, we may have drunk them all. 33 of us drank 36 bottles of wine, or tasted 36 bottles of wine.
Man, that's a great story. I mean, that's awesome. Well,
so when were you at the Ritz-Carlton, Philadelphia?
Oh God, I was at the old location in the mid '90s, and it's where I learned service. I'd always worked in restaurants in Philly, and I kind of grew up with a single mom, not much money, and but I loved food from an early age. I had great grandparents that lived next door to my grandmother, and my great grandmother was alive until I was late teens, and she was a legitimate cook. She was from Hungary, from Budapest, and had come over with her husband, and I think she was a housekeeper outside of Budapest. Like they were from Romania, right on the border, Romania and Hungary. And so her job was, I think it was a housekeeper cook for a wealthy Jewish banking family. And so she spoke German, she spoke Yiddish, she spoke Hungarian, Romanian, and a pretty neat lady. But anyway, she cooked her tail off. So I grew up eating a lot of kind of Eastern European food, and I always liked food a lot, and as you can tell, look at my giant head. And when my mom and I were, living in outside of Philly, and I loved to eat and liked good places, so I couldn't afford to go there, so I just get a job there instead. So I did that in a bunch of places in Philly. I worked at the White Dog Cafe, which is historic. I worked for Jack McDavid. He did an early cooking show with Bobby Flay back in the day. I worked at the Ritz-Carlton. So that's where I learned a lot about food. And then I got really into wine at the Ritz-Carlton. And that was the impetus to move here, in fact. So,
when did you ever meet Horst Schulze?
Oh, Horst Schulze, yeah. I mean, I met him one time. He came through doing a thing. This guy he was a visionary. He was such a visionary.
But well, see, before he bought the Ritz-Carlton name and built the Ritz-Carlton Buckhead, he was the corporate director of food and beverage at Hyatt Regency, and I was the assistant food and beverage director at the hotel across the street from the corporate offices at the Hyatt Regency O'Hare.
Oh yeah, wow.
And somebody told me that he loved to play Miss Pac-Man. So I started practicing Miss Pac-Man every free minute I had until I got really, really good at it. And one day he was walking through the lobby of the hotel, and I went over and introduced myself and said, "Mr. Schulze, I understand that you love to play Miss Pac-Man. I'm pretty good. Would you like to play a game?" And he said, "Yes." And I beat the pants off of him. And the next day I got promoted to be his assistant, the assistant corporate food and beverage director at Hyatt Regency, because he wanted me to teach him to play Miss Pac-Man when we traveled.
Oh, that's hysterical.
Yeah.
That's man.
So he is a absolutely one of the most brilliant visionary, as you said, visionary people in our industry. He, I could go on and bore everybody to tears with Horst Schulze stories about how he invented fajitas and everything else. But let's get back on topic. Well, he and I discovered fajitas in Austin back when nobody had ever heard of fajitas. When we opened the hotel in Austin, nobody ever heard of a fajita outside of Texas. And when we opened the hotel in Austin, we went out to dinner the night about 3 days before the hotel opened, and this dive Mexican Tex-Mex restaurant was serving fajitas. You'd never even heard of a fajita.
Yeah,
Knew what it was. So we put them on the menu. We rewrote the coffee shop menu, and put fajitas on it 3 days before the hotel opened. And I got 12 of the people that worked in the hotel to come to lunch that day and order them. And we sold 400 orders of fajitas the first day.
No way. No way.
Within about 3 months, they were on the menu in every single coffee shop in the Hyatt Regency company chain,
Wow.
which was about 45 hotels at the time. And, then, Applebee's and Fridays and Chili's and everybody else.
Yeah.
But the fajita craze started at the Hyatt Regency in Austin. Anyway, talk to us about, so you and I have a lot in common. And the night when my wife and I took my son to college at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, we drove back to Nashville, and on the first night after we dropped him off, we spent the night at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia and had dinner in the restaurant.
Oh, funny. I might have carried your bags or something. Who knows, right? Brought you some wine.
It would have been, he's 36, so it would have been, 18 years ago. So no, it would have been 2003, I guess.
Oh, okay. I just missed.
Anyway, we should talk about your wines, not my life. Talk to us about the finger. Well, I just quickly, why is your partner Luis Barwal and not Olivier Humbrecht?
I don't know. I mean, I guess Louis would be the one to answer it, but Louis is an adventurer. He always wanted to do something outside of France, and he loves Riesling. He loves Pinot, but it's just not the varietal. I mean, it's the notion of these kind of crisp, dry, aromatic whites that he and I both love, whether it's Chenin or Sancerre, whatever. It doesn't matter. Claret or Uni Blanc or whatever. So for him to do something outside of France where he had ultimate freedom was really interesting. And I think that's was the connection, because this was a undiscovered region. It was full of potential. He had somebody that he trusted and he worked well with, and so I think everything aligned. He told me he had looked at a lot of different places to do something, and he never kind of found the right situation, and this presented it. So I respect him a lot, because I've always found it interesting when you have like a Burgundy, a Pinot producer, and they go to Oregon and they make more Pinot. I don't know if I get it, but at the same time, I'm thinking, why in the hell would you do that? Because you're working in the best terroir on the planet. Like, I get it, but I think that him willing to step outside of the norm of what he was used to, right? He didn't go to Washington to make Syrah or whatever. He went to the Finger Lakes to make dry Riesling and Pinot. I think that says everything about the guy. And I think it tells you what kind of a person he is and what kind of a winemaker he is. He's just so curious and wants this challenge that he couldn't help himself. And it's been I mean, it's been a hell of a journey. It hasn't been easy, but we've had our fair shares of getting kicked in the teeth for sure. I mean, I just pulled up a block of vines at my home farm the other day that I rushed to plant, and the vine material was not very good vine material. And when you put that with a vineyard that wasn't properly prepped, and with bad material, you end up with a very bad planting. So that was $100,000 mistake that I made. And we've made a few of those. I mean, it hasn't all been peaches and cream, but Louis' thirst to keep pushing and desire to just be challenged is you can't say enough about it. He's a nut. He's just a complete machine. And so yeah, hopefully that gives you some insight.
You referred to winemakers from Burgundy making wine in Oregon, and there's always this quote, our Oregon Pinot Noirs or our Oregon Chardonnays are very Burgundian. And there's two things about that kind of my observation is always the same. Why would you want Oregon Pinot Noir to taste like Burgundy? It shouldn't. It should taste like Oregon Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, the more somebody tells me their Oregon Pinot Noir or their California Pinot Noir is Burgundian, the less Burgundian I know it's going to be when I actually taste it. So I really could not agree with you more about this quandary about why, when you're already making Pinot Noir in the greatest place on the planet to make Pinot Noir, why are you going somewhere else and doing it?
Well, people ask us all the time, why don't you guys make Syrah? And I'm like, well, because he makes Syrah in Côte Rôtie and Hermitage. Like, really? I mean, I think we're all set with Syrah. So, here I think we can achieve this level of greatness with Riesling that is worthy of the attention and is worthy of the effort. I think probably in the U.S., there's for truly cool climate viticulture, and I'm not saying we're there by any stretch, but high acid textural white wines with that have power and richness without huge alcohols. I mean, it's amazing what we can accomplish here. So I think I just told this story today. We were in the top 100 with our 2015 Riesling. And then he was also in the top 100 at the same time with Gigondas. And I called him. I said, man, what an accomplishment you have to feel to have that kind of recognition from two different estates, making two different wines in two different, completely different places. Like, what an accomplishment. And he's like, St. Come gives me, it gives me joy. And he's like, but the greatest joy is Forge, because we created this thing from zero. And neither one of us are wealthy guys. We're just a couple wine guys and that are kind of, nuts for this. And I thought that was really, really insightful, and the fact that he was willing to say that, just said, that says everything. He finds so much pleasure in creating this from zero, absolutely nothing, to have something, becoming something. And I think that's his addiction to wanting to be here.
What is it if you said to me or Doug, what are the great Riesling producing regions in the world? You're automatically going to say Mosel, Rheingau, Austria, a couple of places in Australia, one winery in Napa Valley, which weirdly makes great Riesling and Gewürztraminer when nobody else seems to be able to. A couple of wineries in Washington State with the influence of a German winemaker who somehow makes everything from the worst possible wines to the greatest possible wines in Washington State. And I guess Northern Italy a little bit, and then Finger Lakes, McLaren Vale and Eden Valley in Australia, some New Zealand, but mostly it's those places. And it's obvious why the Mosel and the Rheingau make great Riesling. What is it about my point is, what is it about the Finger Lakes? And Doug kind of referred to this, what are the types of soil you work with? But what is it about the Finger Lakes that makes it this unique, amazing place for Riesling?
Well, so if we think about soils, it's shale, because the mother rock here is shale, because the whole region was underwater. During the Devonian period, it was south of the equator. And this is when this mother rock was established. Then you had something called the Great Upheaval that dumped all the water off of the region and created these rivers. Then the Ice Age came and it gouged out these lakes. So why is that important? It gave us access to the shale, which is a friable soft shale. It's not slate like you find in Mosel, but it's a friable, softer shale. But in addition, you had glaciation. So you have this, as the glacier receded, it would dump gravel in some places and sand in others and large rocks in others. But then you also had the lake, which is 630 feet deep right now. But that lake was, another 600 feet deep at different periods. And so the lake, while it's at different heights, you have this other thing that happened, that these deltas were created because as the material that came off the higher elevations came down to the lake, it created these big deltas. And so now we're farming in these deltas and understanding these deltas. But the long and short, I guess, what is often said is the great wines are always made on the edge of where they should be made. And I think that's very much the case here. This is a very, very difficult place to work. It's there's the weather challenges can be really tough. So we have, I think I have more connection with Burgundy. I use Riesling, but that's just a vehicle. I'm not a Riesling guy. I'm using Riesling to express the place. So I'm not even interested really in German wines. It's not, Austrian, yes, but I don't follow German wines. I don't look for Germany for inspiration, because we have from a weather perspective, we actually have a lot in common with the challenges that Burgundy faces. Hail, we get massive hail risk throughout the year. We do have chances of late frost every year. We can have really severe nasty weather events where you get catastrophic amounts of rain in short periods. And then you have the fall. I mean, we work, in the fall, making wine here in the fall is a challenge. And then you have winter pruning where you can have to prune in 2 feet of snow. So this is definitely a place that's right on the cusp, right on the edge of where you should probably make wine. For instance, we have peaches that grow here. The Native Americans had peaches growing here long before us. And the best peaches I've ever had in my life come from this place. But they're brilliant about 7 years out of 10. And then 3 years or so, they're just mediocre. And it's the same thing with cherries. Like our cherries can just be just breathtaking, but we don't get them all the time. And I think that's what makes this a very interesting place. Also, you have cold nights, so you can work with botrytis and have some effects of botrytis, but it doesn't get out of hand because you have these colder nights that can slow the spread of botrytis. It's a host of things. But I think it's certainly capable of greatness. We have a lot of mediocrity. We have plenty of uninteresting wine, but our top wines can really, really, really be, I think, considered in the top of the class. They're right up there with the GGs or whatever of Germany. So I don't know. I think it's that on the cusp of winemaking, wine growing is what gives us such greatness.
The homepage of your website says in very big letters, bone dry Riesling. Is that like a semi-combative way of saying you may think all Riesling is sweet, but you're wrong, and we make these amazing dry wines?
Yeah, it's locally here in the winery. Hold on, I'll show you. This is a sweatshirt. BFD Riesling.
Well, I know what the F and the D stand for. What does the B stand for?
Bone effing dry.
Oh, I got you.
So that comes out of, it comes out of me spending a huge portion of my existence explaining to people that all Riesling's not sweet. And then another portion of my existence trying to understand why American wine Riesling producers put dry on their label and they're 8 or 9 grams.
Right.
And people say, oh yeah, but the acid, it's high acid. And I say, well, consumers could give a rat's ass about acid sugar balance. And if you think they do, then why isn't Riesling, which we know is one of the great grapes, why don't we have a line out the door for people to buy it? So this notion that was started in the 70s about, well, if you have X amount of grams of acid, you can have X amount of grams of sugar because it's a high blah, blah, blah. Guess what? It didn't work. The consumers are uber confused. So why do we keep perpetuating this nonsense? And I see it every day. I see poor consumers. They go, yeah, I bought a Riesling and they said it was dry, but boy, it was still sweet. And I said, oh, who was the producer? And they tell me the name. And I know the producer. I'm like, oh yeah, because he often has 8 grams of sugar in his wines, but they're called dry. And there's nothing wrong with 8 grams of sugar. The problem is we need this clarity. So then they come up with the Riesling scale that once again, it's this sugar acid stupid ratio that no consumer cares about. So at Forge, we're just always below 4 grams. And, I tell people your Malbec from Argentina probably has 5 grams. Your Camus Cab Sauv has 6 grams. So I'm just trying to drive home and create my own category where we are committed to dry white wine, less than 4 grams, and which is the international, level of any wine. is considered dry, no matter where you go in the world. Less than 4 dry, done. And I just wish more producers would take that tact, because we would have way more consumers. A lot more people would drink Riesling in general if we had more clarity on that. So yeah, I guess it is a little combative. As you can tell, it kind of annoys me because I'm a consumer. You know, my wife owns a wine, and I see so many people that have had really bad experiences because somebody said,
I lost you there for a minute. Sorry, or you lost me.
no problem. No,
Um,
it's fine. I was saying, you know, it's just it is combative, a little bit combative on my side and Louis' side too. That, you know, we just want the bit. It's all just hard enough. Why do we make it harder for people to buy wine? And
Well-
why are we selling them Riesling that's you know, that's sweet, but we're telling them it's dry? It's not good. It's just not a nice thing to do.
You know, I tell people there's a real, because most wine stores you go into, the people that work there, I mean, they care about wine, they know a little bit about wine, but they don't know anything about German wines. I mean, they're clueless. And so you ask the sales clerk in most stores, and I mean, I experienced this before I worked, in my life. They just make it up, there's no, so you just, you get, I mean, years and years and years ago, I was a sommelier at a really nice restaurant, and a guy came in and asked me a question about a German wine on the wine list. And I didn't have a clue I didn't even know what the question meant. And
Yeah.
tap dancing, I made up some kind of BS answer. And he said, son, he was older. I was young. He was older. He said, son, I don't know what you think you know about German wine, but you're wrong. If you're going to have German wines on the wine list, you might want to know a little bit about them. But I tell people that there's a very easy way to tell how dry a Riesling is, and that's the alcohol content. As a general rule, if it says 8% alcohol by volume on the label, it's going to be really sweet, because fermentation is yeast eating sugar and creating alcohol and carbon dioxide. If it says 8.5, if it says 11% alcohol, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. If it says 12.5% alcohol, it's going to be bone dry. And so then you can trust that pretty much.
Yeah.
To know. Now, that doesn't tell you how good a wine it is, but at least you know how dry it is. Years ago, I was having a conversation with Niels, I can't remember his name, from St. Urbanshof in the Mosel. And
Sure.
I said, being a German winemaker has got to be the most difficult thing in the world, because when you try to talk to people about your wines, their assumption is they're all sweet, and they have no realization or understanding of the fact that you make amazing dry wines that you're proud of and should be proud of. But then the best wines you make are sweet. But those people who don't like your wines because they're sweet have never tasted those wines that are sweet. They don't like your wines because they think they don't like your wines because they think they're sweet, but they've never tasted the sweet wines, which are the greatest wines you made. And that's the catch-22 with Riesling, is that there are great sweet Rieslings, but they are really, really, really expensive. Most people have never tasted them, but they think they don't like Riesling because it's sweet. So they don't give your wines a chance.
Yeah, and so that's where this kind of, me being the unsophisticated, combative American comes in, that, Louis laughs at, because I'm just, it's frustrating because, I see people drinking, oceans of uninteresting white wine, and we are making these very interesting dry textural white wines that are, made by hand, that are coming from a real place, that are just have such a powerful story. But because of the brand image of Riesling being so damaged, they keep walking. They're afraid. And I think we need the pendulum to swing back this. And I don't think the IRF scale is the solution. I think just keep it very simple. Less than 4 grams, you're dry. Call it a day, and let people recalibrate their senses. That being said, a lot of young people now are. I mean, if I took you downstairs, the amount of 20-something and 30-something-year-olds that I have at any given moment is astonishing. Because these people didn't grow up with only sweet Riesling. They grew up with more dry Riesling available. And so I don't have as big a battle with younger people now than I do with older people that grew up with only sweet Riesling being exported to the US. Oceans of sweet Riesling being exported. So it is getting a little bit better, and I tend to believe that it's going to continue to get better. And I think the next couple of years, you have France got hammered in 21. They're going to have a very short crop. Italy, which never happens, is going to have a short crop. You have transportation issues for New Zealand. You have some short crops on the West Coast. So I think buyers are going to be more open, and therefore consumers, because buyers ultimately, really create brands and categories. And I think buyers are going to be more open to these kind of wines and be willing to take a second to explain them and do a little bit extra legwork. Because I'll tell you, my experience is if you drink these wines, you keep drinking them, and you really become you really enjoy them. I mean, our customers drink a lot of our wines. I mean, they're not buying just our wines, but they have a tendency to drink a lot of them because it gives them pleasure. And so I think it's going to get. I think it's a bright future. And I didn't say that necessarily 5 or 6 years ago, but it's getting easier and easier. So maybe we're making some progress.
Well, talk to us about the Riesling Classique.
Sure. So I work in about an 8-mile stretch on the southeast side of Seneca. Is pretty much where we focus our time and effort. And I probably have something in the neighborhood of 18 different Riesling sites. In 2019, I made 13 different dry Rieslings, 11 single vineyards, a wine called Les Alliés, which just is a selection Louis and I do, and Classique. And the notion is that Classique is the snapshot. It's the kind of introductory expression of forage in Seneca Lake. But we don't make it last. We kind of make it first. So every year we have a good idea of the vintage, and we start to take barrels from all of our different sites and craft Classique, because we want it to be the wine that really just kind of gives a great idea of what the vintage was all about and offers an incredibly high level of value. We don't do single vineyards and what's left, put it into Classique. So Classique comes first, and Louis and I blend, taste, and that's where Classique comes from. It ends up having all of the DNA, as we say, of all of our sites. So we have a barrel of at least every site in Classique, because for us, we want to kind of layer flavors and textures on top of each other to craft a very interesting, wine year in and year out. Then after that, we start to do the single vineyards. So winemaking wise, I mean, we don't do anything very tricky. We do a combination of hand and machine harvest. Pretty classic. We resort again in the winery. And then I have 3 Vaseline presses, antiques from France that we brought over. We go to press, whole cluster, and if it's hand-picked, and full berries if it's been machine-picked. Slow press cycles, maybe 3, 4, 5 hour long. That's why I have 3 presses. And we settle. And then from there, we go to about 70%, 80% old barrique, 228s, 400s, 500s, 600s. Most of the used barrique are coming from Saint Côme in France. I buy some 500s new, usually 4 or 6 500s new each year, but out of 240 barrels, it's inconsequential. Spontaneously ferment and don't rack the wine until blending. And so it's a very, I guess, a classic, minimalist approach. What we say in the Cellars, we do everything to do nothing. So we follow the wines very closely and make sure they're behaving themselves. And typically we finish fermentations in April, May, and do our blends, and we start bottling now, like usually end of June, July. So we bottle pretty late, and then we'll release the wines at the end of the summer. So yeah, it's a real kind of no craziness, no 3 days on skins and no stirring lees 3 times a day or anything like this. We want the purity of the site to shine through, and that's why we're here. We're not here to imprint our ego on the wines. This is an exploration of terroir, and we want the terroir to speak. So we try to get out of the way of the vineyard and let the vineyard say what it has to say. So Classique has been our mainstay from the beginning. It's a bit like Louis, maybe like Côte d'Aron, where it's a really good introduction to what we do. And we try to, the dirty secret is it's essentially a wine that makes no money for the estate. But I felt it was important that we do this because the category was so banged up that I had to give somebody a real convincing argument to drink more of this wine. And that's what we do with Classique. We go all in to make the greatest wine we possibly can. So, and make it at a price that most people can afford. So it's made the same as everything else. It's the same wine. It's just our blend. So this wine, we always want very good purity, very good freshness. We love texture. So we have a tendency to make wines that have a great richness and texture. Common alcohols, maybe 12, 12 and a half in most vintages. And
How much of it do you make?
Well, we're always changing here. So in 2019, I made quite a bit of it, more than we've ever made. I made around like 8,500 cases, give or take. Which is not what I want to do. In 2020, that was about 70% of our production. In the direction of the estate is to do more of the single vineyards over time. So in 2020, we made about 50-50. So we're getting it more on level. Ultimately, what I want to do is, now that I know the vineyards, I know I'm changed the farming in some of the single vineyards, I want to continue to grow that side of it and make less and less Classique. In a perfect world, Classique will be released and people are excited to buy it. They scramble, they buy it up, and then the rest of the year I spend talking about the single vineyards. We'll see, but we had to start somewhere, and so we put all in to make the greatest wine we could, and that's what we continue to do. We'll just make less of it.
Right. Well, it's fantastic. That it's fantastic wine.
Yeah, I like the 19s a lot. You'll notice a couple changes. If you know the 18s, which I still go to therapy about the 18s because that was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. The 18 vintage about killed me. I woke up 2 days after harvest and I had mono for 3 months because it was just the hardest thing we've ever done as a family, so to speak. And we got through that vintage. 19 came along, it was a little easier. And I'm really excited by the wines and the evolution. Every week they're changing and getting better and better. I'm really happy. The purity of the 19s, the focus, I call it the vintage of soil, the vintage of terroir, because you really feel the place at 19. 20s are going to be very easy to sell because they're delicious. They're the sun, they're sunny and happy, 19s were very mineral and very in the earth, and the 20s are just so full of sun, and you put them in your mouth and you have a tan, you know. So they're going to be a lot of fun to sell. But boy, I really do like these 19s a lot.
Well, talk to us about the Freeze Vineyard, please.
Yeah, freeze.
Well, before you do that, what made 2018 so difficult?
Oh my God! In August, we had a once in 300 or 400 year rain event where we had 10 inches of rain in something like 6 hours.
Wow.
And it just beat the vineyards up. Here in Hector, the storm just went around and around and wouldn't leave. And we had cottages washed out to the lake. We had, I mean, I was driving my full-size Toyota pickup to work. I had to come in early that morning, and it was around 5:15, and I turned on a major road, 414, and 2 or 3 times my truck got lifted up and turned sideways. And I ended up getting up near the winery, and there were a bunch of policemen and fire engine guys, and I pulled up, and I'm like, "Hey guys," I'm like, "I don't know if I let anybody drive on that road unless they know what they're doing, because and they're in a truck, because it's pretty dicey." And they just started laughing. They're like, "Rick, the road's closed, man." I was like, "Oh." So it hurt the vines. It just beat them up so bad that we had quite a bit of botrytis, and the problem was we had botrytis and we had sour rot. And in the vineyard, they look very similar. This particular year, they looked very similar. So when you were picking, you really had to understand what you were doing. And for the most part, we accomplished it. We paid a lot extra for picking. And I was in the vineyards with the teams, tasting, showing them the difference. Because for them, they didn't really understand it.
Right.
But when we got the grapes to the winery, we would have to, when we were pressing or sorting, we would have to constantly taste, because with sour rot, you get the flavor of, vinegar and acetic acid, and it's just horrible. So literally we'd be working, and maybe that particular row wasn't picked as well, and you would taste it and you'd have to stop, throw the juice out, and then start again. And I didn't use any juice from Pinots. I only used whole berries for Pinots. So it was nuts. But Mother Nature gave us this insane amount of really, really nice botrytis. So my 18s were kind of like, they're so atypical, but we had 2 choices in 18. We could pick very early and make terribly uninteresting wine, or pick later and push the boundaries and see what happened. And that's what we did. We were all in 18, and it paid off. I mean, the wines are crazy. They're chock full of cardamom and sandalwood. I mean, they were dry, sweet wines. I mean, they were crazy levels of botrytis, and we went to full dryness. So they're nuts. But consumers just absolutely went gaga. Professionals were so confused because they're gorgeous, like sweet, like late harvest wines, but they're dry. So it was crazy vintage. And then 19 ended up being far, far easier, but not terribly easy as the Finger Lakes. 20 was super simple. I could have stayed home in 20. It was easy. Freeze is a site that it was the Freeze farm back in the day. But what's interesting about Freeze is its location is next to another site called Breakneck, and this is an alluvial fan. Breakneck sits right on this big alluvial fan at around 900 feet elevation. And if you were to taste Breakneck, it's very salty and it's very full of the sea. But this alluvial fan, as it spreads out, the soils get a little heavier. And so right in the center of the alluvial fan is Breakneck. And then you go across a small street, like maybe 6 or 8 feet wide, and you're in Freeze. So you feel the saltiness of Breakneck, but then you start to get the fruitiness that you find in these slightly heavier soils. And I think those two next to each other are always interesting, because it shows off the impact of some of these deltas and that they have on the wines. And this is all kind of new for us in the Finger Lakes, thinking about this. So Freeze is I always pick it quite late, much to the chagrin of the grower, who's a friend. He, for the first 3 years, he texted me at 5 o'clock in the morning, all through harvest, and say, "We're picking today, or we picking today?" And I'd just write back, "No, probably not for 10 days." And he would just lose his marbles. And that site wants to be picked late. So I typically am the last pick in that site. And it ripens beautifully. And it handles the late ripening very, very well. So yeah, that's freeze. That's freeze.
When we first started doing these wine conversations in March last year, about a year ago, the local morning anchor on the major TV station here came out and interviewed me about these Zoom tastings that we were doing. It was about a 5-minute spot, and they actually aired it 6 times on the evening news, 6 nights in a row on the evening news.
Oh, wow.
Obviously we've gotten so much publicity about these Zoom tastings because we were in Wine Spectator, we've been in the newspaper here, we've on TV 6 times, etc. But tomorrow night, that Jason DeRusha, who is that fellow that came and interviewed me about these Zoom tastings, is coming to my house for dinner to thank him.
Oh, nice.
Doing that. And I like to cook. So the first course of the dinner is going to be a salmon gravlax with some salmon that I've been curing. Well, I started last night curing. And I cure it, I use fennel instead of dill.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, my plan was to serve the Freeze Vineyard Riesling with the gravlax, assuming that after tasting it tonight, I still thought it was the perfect wine for the gravlax, with a little like drizzle of a sauce made with creme fraiche and mustard and lemon juice.
What do you think?
I think it's I think it's going to be sensational, and I think it's going to be better tomorrow night than it is tonight. I think if I stick the cork back in this bottle and put it in the refrigerator and take it out tomorrow night, it's going to be absolutely, it's going to be absolutely magnificent.
You nailed it. 3 to 5, 6 days is when they really shine, and they'll go 11 days, 11, 12. And I was doing a Scottish Zoom with Scotland that had some journalists and people in it. And I told them, I'm like, keep this wine and taste it for the next 10 days. And if I'm wrong, tell me. And I had probably a half dozen people write to me and say, I thought you were out of your mind. But this wine, in the 5th and 6th day, I drank the rest, they all said. But in the 5th, 6th day, the wines were amazing. They're like, yeah, it's crazy. They don't really want to oxidize. They keep staying fresh. And people bring up acidity a lot when speaking about Riesling. And it's part of the residual sugar debate. And what I found is I tasted all our Rieslings last summer with a journalist. And years ago, Louis told me, freshness is not about just acid, because that if you wanted fresh wines, you could just open the bag and dump more acid in. It's like freshness is an element of terroir, and it can have many different aspects. And I understood that, because Provençal rosé to me is always very fresh because of the mineral aspect, or Cab Franc can have a freshness in rosé because of this green, herbal component. And I kind of put that in the back of my head, and I was tasting the wines with a journalist, and we tasted every vintage, and he looked at me and he goes, man, these wines just stay so fresh. And I'm like, they do. And he's like, and at the same time, we looked at each other and said, salt. The saltiness of these wines is really the fresh element. So which is really intriguing, because this area was born of the sea. We have salt mines under 2 of the lakes. Seneca Lake has active salt mine for over 100 years. Cayuga Lake, the same. So underneath both of these lakes, you have massive salt deposits, sea salt deposits. So I literally have local sea salt. Syracuse. is Salt City. I mean, so saltiness is all around us. It's wild.
You know, it's amazing. Saltiness slash salinity is not a concept or term that I've heard much in my 40 years plus of doing in the wine business. But in the last few months, in these conversations, salinity has come up a lot, about the importance of salinity or the prominence of salinity in some very, very special wines. It's interesting, and it's not, well, you referred to saltiness. It's not always saltiness. It's the saline character of the stone. You know, the salts as a geological term, not a gustatory term. But one of this, you'll love this. One of our first conversations was with Thomas Keller, and I asked him. I assume you know who Thomas Keller is.
Yeah.
So I asked him to tell us an interesting story from his life as a famous chef and restaurateur. And he went to the home of one of his investors, who was the original chief technical officer of Microsoft. So, enormously wealthy man. And there were maybe 10 of them. And this host went down to the wine cellar and brought up kind of, a decent but not enormously great bottle of Bordeaux, and poured everybody a glass, and everybody enjoyed it. The wine was nice. And then he took a bottle and put it in a Vitamix blender for 30 seconds and poured everybody a glass. And according to Thomas, the wine was dramatically improved by 30 seconds in a very violent blender of Vitamix. And then he added a few grains of salt to each glass, like table salt to each glass.
Yeah.
And according to Thomas, you can't argue with, you can argue wine with Thomas, but you can't really argue flavor with Thomas.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
He said the wine, 3 or 4 grains of salt in each glass of wine made an enormous difference in the quality, the perception of quality of the wine, that it made it a lot better.
That's funny.
So he went back to the French Laundry the next day and told his sommelier that they were going to start blending the wine and adding salt to it before they served it. It was Bobby Stuckey.
Oh.
And Bobby said, if that's the case, I quit.
Yeah.
Of course, he was kidding.
That's great.
But
yeah.
This idea of salinity, it is an important concept. That conversation with Niels from St. Urbanshof, that day I opened a bottle of St. Urbanshof Achvener Bachstein cabinet, just the cabinet.
Yeah.
And because I had a customer coming who I thought would really love the wine and buy a lot of it. So he tasted it, he loved it, and he bought a lot of it. I didn't even put the cork back in the bottle. I put it in the cooler, a big cooler that was full of wine, wine, grab and go wine. And I forgot about it. I forgot about this bottle of wine. And it was about 6 months later when I noticed this bottle of wine that had been open for 6 months in the cooler, and poured myself a glass, and it was absolutely magnificent.
Wow.
It didn't even have the cork in the bottle. Now, that cooler was really cold. It had beer in it, so it was really cold. But it hadn't oxidized in the least in probably close to 6 months.
We think we know, and wine just reminds us we know nothing.
Yeah.
It's just a constant reminder. You think you know, but no, this natural thing, this thing that we've been writing about, thinking about, talking about for hundreds upon hundreds of years, continuously amazes us. It's really something.
Well, maybe it could be that 6 months later, when I tasted it, I was having an off day, and the wine was atrocious, and I just didn't notice. But maybe. as I remember it, it was great. You made 137 cases of the 2019 Freeze Vineyard Riesling.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah,
In that case, we bought about 20% of your production.
Nice.
Just so you know.
Great. Oh, that's awesome.
I think Doug could confirm this, but I think we bought 25 cases.
I it's I hope one day I can taste. I hope I can taste more of the wines with you. That you, I'd love to show you the line because it really is it's a fascinating journey because there's all these like there are chapters of this bigger book and we're identifying these chapters. I mean, many of these sites never existed until we started separating them out, and now it's been amazing to watch these places come alive and have their own identity. Freeze wasn't really a thing. Breakneck wasn't a thing. Railroad, Willow, the list goes on. These places really didn't exist. There were vineyards, but often they were just kind of put together in big blends. And in the last few years, we've been isolating these sites. And it's like, I don't know, we're allowing them to become their own thing. And it's exciting. And people walk in the winery now and they'll say, hey, how's Freeze this year? I loved last year. Tell me about it this year. Man, I really like this about this one. Or, oh, I love this one about this one. And none of that existed. Just a few years ago, none of that existed. And that's been one of the most rewarding things for me is that I'm showing the neighborhood that I live in, the place that I call home. And we're constantly learning more about it. And you would think this place has been here for so long, like, yeah, don't you know everything? And we're just getting started. And there's all these stories and all these places that are now getting a chance to tell their story. And it's just awesome.
We had one of these tastings with on Trimbach from Trimbach in Alsace. They've been making wine for 395 years.
Yeah.
They're getting ready to celebrate their 400th anniversary. And so they have a little head start on you in the Riesling category.
A little bit, yeah.
I have just one more question, then I'll let you go because I know I asked you for an hour of your time. We're already over that.
But, it's all good.
We had one of these conversations with Ernie Lozen, who obviously makes really great wine. Well, as I referred to earlier, he makes really great wine in Mosul, and he makes some really great wine in Washington State, and he makes some really great wine in Washington State.
Yeah.
And he was reading he inherited a big library from his grandfather, and he was reading about that his grandfather used to make dry Riesling that he aged in foeders for 20 years before bottling it. And now Ernie's copying that. He just released the first vintage of a dry Riesling aged in foeders for 20 years. And Nikolai Hoff in Austria does the same thing. They have a Riesling called Vinotech that they age for, depending on the vintage, 18 or 20 years before they bottle it. Do you have any thought on that? You don't have the history to be able to age a wine for 20 years, but
yeah, that would be really fun, wouldn't it? No, I mean historically, right? Most Rieslings were in wood, foudre or whatever, for 2 or 3 years because they would have to keep racking them, and they would rack them, 20 or 30 times to get clarity and to get rid of the yeast because they didn't have the filtration abilities. So, which it says a lot about Riesling. That Riesling likes oxygen, and so I know when we started making wine here and we were using barrels, people kind of poo-pooed it. But if you look at history, is that Riesling, a lot of Riesling was made in barrels. It was the vessel that you had around, and you had plenty of it, and it worked. So we kind of went that way, and so in our own little ways, the way we press the wines, we use quite a bit of oxygen, and the wines love it. And so the fact that we were talking about these wines able to survive exposure to oxygen for 10 days or 20 days or 6 months says a lot about Riesling. So I think it would make some sense to do prolonged aging. And I want to do more experiments in that direction in the coming years. We're, a small winery, like most small wineries, every dime counts. So we, I'm sold out of red wine here. People are going nuts, and I'm sorry, but if people want to buy the wines, I sell them to them. So holding wines back has been a little tricky, but I'm almost at the stage now that I could hold a 500 back from a great vineyard for a couple of years and watch the evolution. And it would be, maybe we'll do it this year. If we have a good vintage. Maybe I'll hold a 500 back and watch it. And I'd have to figure out how to, if you top it with the same vintage, or do you top it with the next vintage? Like, I just have to talk to Louis, but it could be an interesting prolonged aging trial. Would be fun.
Well, if it matters, Ernie's wine, it's bottled in magnums. The bottles are hand blown.
Yeah.
And some musician wrote a song about each bottle. And he's going to sell it for they're selling for $40,000 a magnum.
Yeah, Ernie was here at the winery. We hosted a bunch of Johannes Selbach. A bunch of them were here for a seminar tasting, and yeah, Ernie's got some. He's not afraid to be a showman and do cool stuff. He's not afraid to push the envelope. And that's great. I love it. I think it's amazing.
Well, I think seriously, Rick, thank you for your time, but mostly thank you. My dinner tomorrow night, which is an important occasion, is going to be a greater success because of this marvelous wine that I'm going to serve with my Gravlax, which I hope is up. I hope my Gravlax is good enough to pair with your Riesling.
I'm honored, and that's why we make these dry wines, because we're food guys, and I love these wines at the table. And that's a hell of a good pairing, because you need fat for these wines, and they love fat. And
the oiliness in the Riesling will be beautiful with the oiliness in the salmon. Well,
let's one day, either if you come this way or if I come your way, let's make sure that we get together, and I would love to take some time with you and try some of these other sites and get your opinion on them, because I think you'd find it a lot of fun.
Please come to the Twin Cities sometime and host a tasting with us in our private dining room for our friends and customers. Be a huge success, and I would be honored to host that with you.
Fine. I'm getting ready to make some life changes where I can have more time to focus on forage. I've been burning the candle for 10 years on both ends, and it's finally, I'm getting to the point where I'm going to be making some good changes that are going to be really important for forage. So I look forward to having more time to visit people like you.
Well, tell Bruce I said hello.
All right. All the best. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks,
thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.